There's far too much hurt, far too many broken relationships.
Far too much anger, far too much hatred.
Let's take hate out. Let's take hate out of the conversation.
Let's take hate out of the conversation. Don't stop the conversation.
But have it without the hate. Conversations can be hard, difficult, and even uncomfortable.
But to build a better future, we need to have them.
Let's work together.
Let's work together to take hate out of the conversation.
Hey, welcome back to another episode. Thanks for joining us. Jason, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
It is a pleasure to be here. I'm honored to be here.
Honored, yeah. We always joke we're the biggest podcast on this side of Mount Salem, so it's a big deal.
That's perfect.
Big, yeah. Hey, so we are in the middle of a campaign, I guess. We want to do conversations on hate, and we want to do real conversations about some of the issues that we're really facing 2021, and I'm sure you are on social media, so you know all this stuff, right? I mean, people on both sides, people are really fired up, and I think there is an authentic movement. People are searching for ways to end some of this stuff. I think it's unreal that in 2021 we were still talking about the color of people's skins. You're still talking about some of these things that you're like, how as humans, like we've sent people to the moon. Like we've done amazing things.
Yeah.
And then on the core level, you're like, but we still don't like each other for the wrong color.
Yeah.
Like, what?
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are kind of going, there has to be a way. There has to be something.
Yeah.
And what I found, at least, and what we found here, is that a lot of those conversations are always about other places. So we need to end the racism that was going on in Minneapolis, or we need to end something that's happening in another country or another part of the world. And very rarely do we take enough time to kind of go, okay, well, what about, Elmer? What about what we're living in?
Yeah.
And so I found it interesting because I don't know what Kitchener was like, but we had some controversy last year. I don't know what your...
I think I've heard rumblings about that. Yeah.
So there was some... But you saw this hatred in this town. And at the same time, everyone's posting about how we solve all the hatred around the world. And so we felt like in 2022, let's go and let's have some real conversations. And so how you got suckered into this was that you do a lot of conflict mediation stuff. And so we're like, we'll give you an hour. We'll solve all our problems. And we'll kind of go from there. So I don't know if that's cool.
Wash our hands of this. Series is complete.
So let's start with a little bit who you are. Yeah. Let's get into your workplace, kind of what you do as a living. And then let's talk about that and kind of the goal where we're heading if you're watching and listening. Talk about workplace and family. It's one thing to talk about the issues that, are out there. But often, how do you even love your own spouse? Yeah. Like you get to choose one. Now, given, I always laugh, you can choose one of like the 3 billion.
Right.
But really, like most of those would say no. So your selection is a little smaller.
Yeah, there is that whole reciprocal.
Right.
It needs to be reciprocal. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I mean, this is a choice you make. This is who you choose to be with. Workplace, same thing. In our region here, I mean, you can work almost anywhere. Everybody's hiring right now.
Yeah.
So you choose to be at a workplace, and a lot of the conflict and a lot of the stress we feel comes from those two places.
Yeah.
And so, anyways, a little bit about yourself, and we'll get into that.
All right. So I hail from, the growing metropolis of St. George, which is just south of Cambridge, or Kitchener, I meant. Cambridge. No, Cambridge.
How long has your day been so far?
Oh, it's been a drive. So yeah, just south of Cambridge, north of Brantford. I always start with Cambridge because I don't want to be associated with Brantford, I guess, for some reason. Anyways, that has nothing to do with anything.
We just lost a bunch of viewers, but that's fine.
A whole bunch. We're just, isolating people right off the bat. Where was I going with that? Oh, yeah. So I'm from St. George, small little town, and I got my start in conflict management. I actually was working in social services, working with developmental disabilities, mental health, at-risk youth, things along those lines. Okay. And they sent all the program managers to this course around conflict, a one-day course around conflict. You attend the course just like this, next hour, all the world's problems are solved in your workplace and beyond. Wow. I know, it was magical. And right probably about halfway through, we were doing like some different role plays and different things like that. And there was this negotiation that we had to do around these oranges and stuff like that. And right away, one of the first thoughts that popped into my mind was like, I think we're going to need these oranges for different reasons. So tell me about why you need these oranges. And we solved it within 3 minutes, right? And no one else in the class got this. Like, they were like, yeah, well, we decided that we were going to split them in half, or, they were just a good negotiator. They took 80% or whatever, right? And I was like, oh, maybe there's something to this. And something just, kind of hit me the right way of like, oh, people have been coming to me for most of my life and just, wanting to have some of these conversations and things like that. And I had no idea what mediation was or anything along those lines. And learned about it, through that class, got really interested, went on and got, some schooling in it and stuff like that. And I'd always wanted to go and work with organizations, work with different faith-based communities, things along those lines. And knew that because of my age when I started, I've been doing this for over 10 years already. So you can imagine what age I was when I started.
Yeah, I've seen some of the pictures you put. You look like a kid still.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, arguably still do. So,
well, the beard helps, right? If you grow the facial hair, it gives you a little bit, right?
I know. It took over 30 years for this.
It hasn't shaved since he was 18.
Haven't shaved, yeah. But yeah, and knew I wanted to get into that line of work, and knew because of my age I wasn't going to walk into CEO's office and be taken seriously at all. And so looked at what are some other things I could do, and started in family mediation. Doing a lot of divorces, separations, custody access, all that kind of fun stuff. And before I finally was able to kind of transition into that, and so a bit about my experience. Yeah, I've done well over 500 mediations, and for those of you who don't know, mediation is that process of dealing with people that really aren't a big fan of each other right now, and trying to kind of help find that middle ground, whatever that looks like for that specific situation.
So is that something you do like privately? Is this something you're working for an organization, or just because if people are listening, I think sometimes I find, at least, I'm not aware of half the stuff. And so even as a pastor, when people come in and they're like, hey, I'm really struggling, right? Your generic send to is just like, okay, well, let's find you a counselor.
Right.
Right. So is that a private thing? Is there stuff that's, would there be stuff out here that is like that? Is that a government thing, or just a?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above, to be honest. Okay. And so, there are mediators within the government that are working on, auto claim insurance, frauds, awesome. Small claims courts, all the various courts, right, have, certain mediators and things like that. For me, I work for myself, so all on a private thing. So I do, multiple different things, from mediation to coaching. So a lot around conflict coaching, grief coaching, leadership coaching, that kind of thing. And then do quite a bit of speaking and training around both mental health as well as conflict, and more into that kind of grief side of the equation.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's start with some reflections here a little bit. So you've done, you say about 500. What are some of the things that you've picked up on dealing with families at that moment that you kind of have learned, and what it takes to get, because there have to be some couples that I'm assuming you get to. I mean, if they're at mediation, arguably there's still a shot. Is there certain things that you saw in those situations where you're like, man, yeah, because you had A, B, C, and D, it gave you the best shot to actually restore this? Was there any of those types of things you picked up? Or
so in my career, most of the people that came, they were like, we want to separate from one another. We're not trying to get back together. Sometimes one of the parties would like to get back together. Right. The other person had already thought through and everything along those lines. So the majority of my conversations were, how do we split this fairly? And how do we, where's Johnny going to sleep tonight? Right. And where is he going to be sleeping in 3 weeks from now? What does that look like? And when you're having some of those conversations, especially around kids, it's tough. Right? Because you're going from both of you are living with your kids 100% of the time, to neither of you being able to live with your kids 100% of the time. Right? And so it's a very emotionally charged conversation in so many ways. Even when you're dealing with finances and stuff, it's not just money, right? Like it has so much more meaning to it than that.
Well, and when you're at that point, there's also a lot of anger. So it's not like you're in there being like, how can I be the most fair about this?
Yeah.
How can I get the most for my side, right? And
yeah.
It's complex.
Well, it was interesting. There was multiple times meeting with people that people would come in and be like, this whole marriage was a sham. Like I knew it from the very day. And I'm sitting there thinking like, well, you must have some good times, right? Like you got married in the first place.
Right.
You have 4 kids. It must have been some half decent times.
At least 4 good nights.
Like there must have been some times where you're both on the same page here, and they're like, no, the whole marriage was a sham. And I think that's part of when we get into conflict, that we can start rewriting the past as well. That we're seeing, this is how this has made me feel, and now this is the lens in which I view all future communications through, as well as past. And so it's just really fascinating.
That is interesting. Okay, so let's dive into that a little, because I'm very because I thought the same thing often when people come and they're like, I never loved this person. Well, no, clearly at some point you did. I'm not. You can't sit there and argue with them, but you're like, unless you got manipulated into the wedding, like at some point, you thought this was a good person. So why does the brain do that? Is there
how does that work?
Well, yeah, like, because I think that's part of it, is that you get so blinded. Is it that you're blinded by the anger and the hurt? Is that a trauma reaction that your brain kind of gives? Because in spouses, it is that way. Like, it honestly feels that way, where, one day you're like, man, I love this person. Like, I couldn't believe. And then all of a sudden your brain is like, I never loved this person. Like, that's a significant transition, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, it's not an instantaneous, that just all of a sudden one event happens and it's like, it's completely changed my entire world, right? And I'm sure there are certain instances for sure, especially when we're talking about, abuse and like some of those really heavy topics. For sure, there are certain events that can like just flip it on a switch. And even then, one-time thing doesn't always switch it for us. Usually it takes, a number of different moments and over time for that to kind of to fog the glass, if you will, right? But I think that's part of that consistency, right? Like if we're consistently having negative interactions with our spouse or with loved ones, family members, whoever that is, people in our workplace, we're going to consistently start. That tone is, regardless of how they say it, we're going to interpret it in a certain way, right? And so there's intent behind every single action of, why we say what we say, why we do what we do, why we don't speak up when we sometimes maybe should have, right? But on the flip side of that action, there's also how it's impacted me, right? And so I could, say a comment to you, and I could have the best intentions in the world, but if it doesn't land for you, then that's kind of an issue, right? And the way it typically works is the impact that it's had on us is what we ascribe their intent to be. Right. And so if it's a negative, if I tell a joke and it lands negatively, right, because it's off color or whatever the reason, it just doesn't land for whatever reason, because it's a corny dad joke or whatever, right? And, right. Then, and I'm offended by it. And then I will assume, oh, you told that on purpose. Like, why are you saying that kind of stuff to me, Albert? That's not very nice. Right. Whereas, you're like, oh, he kind of like he's got a smile, like landed well, perfect. Intent solved.
So then, because you're married, so let's. How do you not get there? Because there was a time again where you didn't assume that about the other person. Now I get it's a slow fade, but are there things you can actively do in your marriage in terms of not getting there? Or how do you not get there? Yeah. Or maybe you are there with your wife and I'm bringing up something really traumatic. And sorry about that.
Let's just rip the Band-Aid right off, eh? Well, even just to continue on from that joke example, right, is that if we, so that impact and that intent has kind of happened in this private realm. Right, where it's internal to both of us. And so there may be some seepage into that public space, if you will. Seepage, that's a terrible word.
No, I think it's good, actually, because it's often crap, right?
But it's accurate,
right?
You're
100%. Well,
so like if all of a sudden I get really mad, like that joke made me really angry, you might see, my fist curl up, or you might see that vein in my forehead or whatever, right? That's kind of the seepage, if you will, right? But for the most part, like if I don't say anything and I just keep that in that private realm, then that kind of balls up and continues to kind of avalanche, if you will, right? Like I've always kind of said, we can shove conflict under a rug, but sooner or later we're going to have a mountain in our living room, right? And so how do we, get beyond that? I think part of that is bringing that stuff that's happening in the private, bringing that into that public space and having a conversation about it.
So that's interesting. So the podcast that we recorded yesterday, and I believe it's going to be released before yours. So this will probably make sense. And if not, sorry about that. The example he gave was very much that exact same thing. That you go into these houses, and there's basically kind of a culture built around this. That everybody pretends nothing's wrong, but there's this massive mount in between you where you can barely see each other over this mount.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that elephant in the room, right?
So again, do you do stuff on, in what's the right word, conversations? You have a course even.
Tackling tough conversations. Yeah. It's in that same element as fierce conversations, difficult conversations. Right. Yeah.
So
this one's tough conversations though.
Well, how do you do some of that? And is there, obviously the reason we don't do it is because they're hard. Mm-hmm. But the reason a lot of that gets swept under the rug is just because it's just simpler.
Right. Right. Well, I think about it, right? You remember when we had those Dear Abby columns that you'd write into the newspaper and stuff? I mean, now it's all on blogs everywhere, but, it'd be like, Dear Abby, I'm planning this great wedding and my mother-in-law is now involved, right? And now it's all going to the pits, right? Or, I'm a grandmother. I've been watching my grandson for the last, year, and I just can't handle it anymore, because I have so many things on the go. I just can't do that anymore. How do I tell my son that? Right? Or, I'm in a workplace and I don't know how to tell my coworker that, they don't have the best hygiene. Right? And we kind of justify it to ourselves of, well, I don't want to tell my son that I can't watch my grandson anymore because I don't want him to think that I don't love my grandson. I don't want to think that I don't want to be of help or service. I don't want to tell my mother-in-law because I don't want her to feel bad because I want her to be involved because, we're going to have this life together in some capacity, in some way. I don't want to tell this person that they smell terrible because I still have to work with them, right? And so we kind of put all the blame on, I can't do that because it's going to make this person feel this way. When realistically, that's like the surface level kind of excuse, right? If we kind of dive under that, what's really going on there? It makes us feel uncomfortable. And we'd much rather avoid it because we like to be comfortable, right? And so what does it look like for us to get more comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Mm-hmm. And not like dive into the deep end of like walking around and telling everyone all your thoughts about them, and, right? Like, hey,
there's no filter.
Just by the way, you smell, right? Right? Like there's still a tactful way to do it. Yeah. Like, hey, screw off or whatever the case is, right? We still need to be respectful of others, of course, right? But yeah, part of that is looking at some of those underlying reasons, what's actually going on for me, right? And so the model that, that my course is on, and I won't go into all kinds of things about it, but at the very center of it is that self, right? Of being aware, what are some of my triggers? What are some of the things that, are going to set me off? What's going on for me? Is this a conversation that I do need to have? Because sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is better to leave it untouched, to shove it under the rug, or just, am I even going to be thinking about this in 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 years? Is it going to have any impact on me? No, maybe not. Okay, maybe I don't need to have that conversation. Or if I am going to be thinking about this in, 5 weeks, then maybe I do need to address this because it could, snowball into something else.
In coaching, we often use the don't talk to me for 24 hours. And if you're still mad after 24 hours, is that would be that same type of concept? Like if day after day, it's really driving you nuts, at some point you're going to have that conversation. But often we get you get so mad about something.
Oh my goodness.
And I know
for sure.
In our office, I won't name names, but he's definitely our sound guy. For him, often in the office, we joke as soon as we're a little snappy with each other, we're like, go eat.
Yeah.
Just go eat and then come back. And we're still mad at them, we'll have a conversation. But I think guys, often it is very simple stuff like that if you don't have that pause to say, okay, well, I need to reevaluate whether I'm actually really mad or I'm just emotional.
Well, it's true, right? Like, someone cuts us off or something along those lines. Right. We jump to road rage. We jump to flipping them off. We jump to that son of a...
Unless you're a Christian, you just do it in your heart. So it
right. Then we just pray, dear God, I hope they crash. I've
never done that. You do that what?
I'm a terrible person that way.
All right, we'll do confession as soon as this is over. It's good.
But it's true. Like even for myself, I'm trained in this. I've been doing this for 10 years, helping other people, deal with conflict, have some of these tough conversations. And I still find that I start with screw you. instead of, I wonder what's going on for that person, or I wonder what's going on for me.
Right.
I come out of that place of judgment awfully quick. And I think we're hardwired for it, to be honest. That, there seems to be two different ways of approaching things. One is out of that spirit of judgment. And I don't mean judgment in a terrible way. We need to take in information, we need to make decisions, we need to keep going, right? Yep. Like I mentioned in the beginning, I used to work for a social service agency, and, there's different communication styles. And one of those is collaborative, which sounds really great on paper. We've been, facilitating these models in different classes and stuff, and people are like, "Oh yeah, I got to become more collaborative." Then and it's like, yeah, that can be wonderful, but then we're going to take everyone's opinion on everything. And coming from a social service background, I remember meetings and being like, "Well, what kind of toilet paper should we buy?" It's like, I don't know, buy whatever's on sale. Like, why do we all need opinions on this? Just go buy whatever's on sale. Just get the white stuff. Maybe double ply at least. Like, let's not be too cheap, but right? And so we need to come at things, I think, in a certain way. And I think that's just part of our human survival in that sense. We need to judge that situation and take action. Otherwise, you're eaten, right? But the other way of dealing with things is through the spirit of curiosity. And I think, there's some studies in neuroscience that show that we can't hold judgment and curiosity in our minds at the exact same time.
Interesting.
And so often we have to make a conscious choice about that. And so if we're hardwired to come at things from a place of judgment, then sometimes I think we have to work on or start building some of those habits of what does it look like to approach this with curiosity. And so both of those have their place for sure, judgment and curiosity in this sense. And I think we come out of things from a place of judgment far more.
My wife says my grammar's terrible. Feel free to speak however you want. I won't
both
judge.
Written and spoken.
Right. 100%.
Right? And so if we were to come at things from a place of curiosity, how does that change some of those conversations, especially those difficult conversations that we're having with our spouse, with our kids, with our, people within our community, whether it's, personal or workplace, that this spirit of curiosity that all of a sudden, I wonder why they said that. Or I wonder why I took it that way. Right. And I think, that's why, part of that beginning stage is that that self-awareness, that self-recognition, that self-compassion even of, I really messed that up. I was trying to compliment them on this and turned out to be pretty backhanded.
Okay. So let's go into that for a bit. Because what I see, and I mean, a lot of sitcoms, they make jokes about this and whatever, but you see this idea where that timing doesn't align for both. Mm-hmm. And so you see a guy who, oh shoot, I haven't been nice to my wife for a while. And so then he tries, but she's not in a place where she's willing to accept it now. And then she snaps back. And then he's like, well, then screw you. Yeah. So how do you navigate? So let's say you're in a place where you have this, let's say I offended the wife and I whatever. And so I go and I'm like, okay, so out of a spirit, of curiosity, I'm trying to come at this with the best possible approach. But when they're not ready, it just seems like then that cements that deeper. So how do you navigate those types of moments that it doesn't just end up making this worse? Because very rarely when both of you are mad at each other, do both of you guys come out at the same time? You know, not like in the movies where you're like, oh, I'm sorry, let's make out. Like it's not really real for most couples. It's one of you may be over sooner than the other. And so how do you deal with that? Yeah, I mean, we get stuck in this conflict cycle basically, right? And so I know if I go home after this and I make, a comment, my wife doesn't take it the right way, she will respond. I already know how she'll respond, right? Pretty much exactly what she'll say. I know how I'll respond. I know how she'll respond to that response. I know that I'll end up sleeping on the couch tonight, right? If we take a serious look at any of our close relationships, there's this conflict cycle that kind of appears. An action is done. Person A responds. Person B responds to person that comment. Which leads to another comment, and pretty soon we're just on this kind of wheel, right? And so part of the invitation within that is, where do we put that brick so that we can break that cycle? Part of the difficulty is we can't change anyone else's behavior, right? I remember a few years ago, we were going up to the cottage. It was guys' weekend. We had to put in the docks and stuff like that. And so I've got a bunch of my buddies and their kids. And I was going with my one friend and his two boys, his two oldest boys, and then my son as well. And we're driving up. We're like just out of Cambridge. So we're like,
20 minutes on like a 3.5 hour drive, and the kids are already just going insane in the back. That I'm driving, I'm already just want to like pull over, kick them out, and just keep going. They haven't seen each other for a while. They're all pumped to go away for the weekend, right? And so at some point, I said to my son, I said, "Hey, Carson, get your boys under control back there." Like, and he's like, "Well, what are you always telling me, Dad?" And I was like, "Oh shoot, a lot of things. Which one are you gonna pick?" And wouldn't you know, the smart little boy, he goes, "Well, you can't control anyone else's behavior, Dad. You can only control your own." And I was like, "You little shit."
Exactly
right? Yeah.
Even
yeah.
waiting.
It's like, welcome to lesson 2 now, son. Right? And at the same time, he's right. Yeah. Like, you can't control anyone else's behavior. You can only control your own, right? That's the old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink, right? And so in those invitations, see how quickly, when person A responds and we respond to their response and so on and so forth, sometimes it takes half a second, sometimes it's, 5 minutes later. But notice what kind of mindset we're coming out of when we're responding to those, right? It's probably going to be out of a mindset of judgment as opposed to that curiosity. And so in those in those situations, what can we do to change? Because if all of a sudden we react in a different way, you and I are in a long-term relationship. We get into a fight over, mayonnaise or whatever it is.
It'll be something stupid.
It'll be toothpaste. Yeah.
Mayonnaise wasn't stupid.
Yeah, mayonnaise was too in-depth.
It was food. I'm sorry, it was food. It's very important.
Mayonnaise isn't real to my life. I understand toothpaste.
But we get into some silly argument about whatever, right? And if I already know, how you're going to respond to that, I can already start preparing my response. But if you respond in a different way, I have no choice but to respond differently. And all of a sudden, we're not in that same cycle anymore.
Is that an issue of listening, or is that an issue of, is that something different?
I think it's all of the above. It's listening, it's ego, it's, that need to be right. It's that lack of curiosity. It is that, probably all of our past experiences and the reasons that we go to therapy in the first place, right? So, part of that is listening, because often we say, we're listening. I'm listening to what you're saying. And really, in my mind, what I'm doing is already preparing my response to what you've just said. And once I start doing that, I've stopped actually listening to what you're saying.
So how do you... So let's say you got friends, and they're fighting over this mayonnaise, hypothetically. That we would both come from it from an angle of, we need community around us. But I think a lot of us find ourselves in places where, you have friends who are really struggling in their marriage, or whether that's a relationship with a kid, whatever that is. But what are some of the things in terms of, helping somebody with conflict? How do you step into that well? And I know there's no black or white answer, but I think that a lot of us find ourselves in that tension. And then it feels like, well, if I don't say anything, and then all falls apart, I'm going to feel guilty. But then I feel like if I say something, I'm going to make them feel more terrible because now they know that we know, right? Like it's one of those where you're kind of circling around it, and nobody completely knows what to do. So how do you navigate that maybe from a bit of an outsider's point of view?
Yeah, from an outsider, I think it gets really tricky, right? Because we can, all of us are problem solvers. In that sense, we see a problem, we want to solve it, right? And what's that saying? If all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail.
Right.
The same approach doesn't work in every single situation, right? And that's one of the reasons I don't just do mediation. I do coaching, I do group facilitation, I do assessments, so on and so forth, because different situations call for different approaches to that conflict. And so, if we just run everything through a mediation lens, there's going to be times where we're doing a lot more harm than good. And so I think one of the first things we can do is get really clear on our intention. What are we hoping to do in this situation? And then, part of it is, what skills do I actually have in order to do this? And maybe we don't have the skills in order to do that, right?
Well, that's actually good, because you think about any other situation. If you come on like a medical,
right,
somebody in medical distress, you're not just like, oh man, I got to do. Well, if you have no skills, You do what you can. Well, I can call 911.
Yeah. Oh, just walk it off. Oh, but like my spine is cracked. Like, no,
hold
I
your
can't.
leg on. Walk it.
Yeah. Right. Well, I mean, it's the same as I remember years and years ago, I got in this motorcycle accident. I mean, I've lived to tell the tale, obviously, but
no, it's good.
And there's people that were like, here, just drink this water and like have this food. Like you need something in your system. And then there was another person that was like a nurse there, and they were like, don't give him anything, because if he has to go into like surgery or something like that, like then you kind of screwed that opportunity for him. It's like put a blanket around him, tell him to not move, and just like let him sit in someone's car. Like, come on, right? But we have all these best intentions, right? And I mean that's what I mean. That's where I was going with the problem solver. Sorry, squirrel.
No, it's
good. We have this problem solving kind of nature to us, that we see a problem, we want to solve it, right? And not all problems are meant to be solved. Some are tensions to navigate. And that's a very different approach than trying to solve that problem. And so one of the things that we can do is, be better problem finders. Like, are we actually even talking about the same problem right now? Because often in conflict, we're not. I think we're talking about X. You think we're talking about Y. What we're really doing is talking about Z. Right? And so are we even trying to solve the same problem at this point? And I think that's part of what we can try and help people do. And so I think another part, so if one is our intention, one is helping actually define what the problem is. And the other is, how do I want to operate in this? So if, I'm going to go, bring up a touchy subject, how do I bring my best self to this conversation, so that I can model what good communication looks like for you, as well as how do I help the two of you, understand each other and hear one another. Because I think one of the biggest things is around that listening. That I think many of us think that we're really good listeners, and yeah, many of us are. But think about how often have you spent time actually practicing your listening? Right. And that sounds like a really funny thing to do. But, since we were born, we've been taught how to speak, right? Use your outdoor voice, how to speak to authority or your elders. You go
pastor.
Or your pastor. It's very different than how you speak to your friend.
Clearly, nobody's teaching that, because I get thrown under buses around here.
But like we learn all these things in school, and as we go on, we learn how to form a hypothesis and then argue that. Some people go into debate class. Some people even go even further into various how do we communicate with one another? But where along the lines have we ever been trained to listen? Right? Other than, I used to have this guy I worked with that said, if I wanted your opinion, I'd give it to you. Right? But we're not, told, where are we taught how to listen other than like sit down, shut up, and listen? Oh, okay. That's all I do? Okay, perfect.
Is that maybe some of the best advice too, in terms of when you have friends who are in conflict, maybe sit down and go, look, you look stressed, and then shut up?
Yeah. Yeah. Tell me about it. What's going on for you? Oh, so-and-so, they're, causing this rift and they're making a big deal out of nothing. Oh, so what does that look like? So why do you think it's not a big deal? Why do you think it is a big deal to them? Right? People are really smart and they're really stupid.
Right.
Right? But I'm a pretty firm believer that we have most of the answers that we actually need inside of us somewhere. And I mean, if I tell you, Albert, you really need to go to therapy, right?
You're not wrong.
Yeah,
but carry on.
But for a lot of people, they're like, heck no. No, I don't. Right? Just because you told me that.
Yeah.
What do you know? You don't know anything. But if we start talking about, life and all these things, and so who are you talking to about that? Oh, I'm not really talking to anyone. Well, who in your life can you talk to? There really isn't anyone. Oh, maybe there's a paid professional for that.
Right.
Oh yeah, that's a good idea. Right. Or they come up with it on their own of, you know what, maybe I really should be talking to this therapist, or maybe I really should be approaching this situation that way, and so on and so forth. Right. The power of a good question is something that, can't be underestimated, I don't think. And at the same time, I think there's a certain value in knowing, okay, is this worth my time anymore? And cutting our losses. right? Which is a totally different approach,
Right.
right? And so I think there's varying degrees, and I think starting with that question asking, starting with that curiosity can be a really good base. And if we're continually, getting tromped on, they're not honoring some of the things that we've asked them to do. They're not respecting some of those different boundaries and things along those lines. Then we can get a little bit more, forthright. Get a little bit more, intense about the situation. I have every, intention of treating everything that you say with respect, and I expect the same thing from you. Right. Yeah. And to the point of, this is a completely one-sided relationship and this just isn't working for me anymore. Right.
Well, and you know what? It's interesting, the listening piece, because for me, at least, I struggle with listening. Even so, when we're doing these podcasts, one of my challenges is that I'll get caught up in listening and then the other person stops talking. And I'm like, crap, I need a question.
That's what editing's for.
Right. This is why I don't listen. Right? I need to know. I think there's the struggle with silence in our culture. We don't do well with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of those little things. I think even in marriage, like, I know for us as Christians, we're always taught, don't go to bed angry.
Right.
But I think sometimes you can't solve those problems in that short little period of time. I think there's times in that space where you need to allow yourself to think this through and to listen. Okay, well, this is what she said she felt. Why would she feel that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think sometimes, again, we don't sweep it under the rug, but we deal with it so fast that you may as well have swept it under the rug.
Right. Yeah.
And then the other thing that I've seen, just in terms of helping your friends with conflict, at least in my opinion, the danger of walking in and giving your opinion is the fact that they're going to blame you when things don't go well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think helping people find their own conclusions. I've watched a lot of people who do a lot more peer mentoring type of thing. Instead of saying it's counseling, they'll say it's. But yeah, exactly what you said. Like having the belief and walking into a conversation. My buddy, him and his wife are struggling, but he's not an idiot.
Right.
And I think sometimes when it comes to conflict, I think we almost deal with it that way, that this person's dumb and they need us to come in and fix. Whereas maybe just if I ask the right question, it can trigger the right conversation.
Yeah.
And then you realize this is potentially a lot more complex.
When it becomes a savior complex, right? Like, well, of course you haven't fixed it. You haven't asked me to come yet.
Right.
I have all the advice. I have all the guidance that you could possibly need, right? But I think there's something with that silence that, we're not, how many group situations have you been in that, everything all of a sudden turns silent and then someone's just like, always like, oh, so how about them Blue Jays? Or,
you know who that someone is? It's me.
Right.
I hate silence.
Right.
Oh,
or there's
so bad.
There's comments of like, oh, wow, that was awkward. Right.
Right.
There's been a lot of trainings that I've been at that, I start, part of the trainings and been like, there's going to be awkward silence in this. Part of my entire training is around awkward silences, like of just being awkward with like people who are just like staring daggers at each other or whatever, right? Like it's always awkward. But there's this gift that silence brings to us, right? And especially if we're actually listening to that person, if you went on this rant about the mayonnaise, about, why, me leaving it on the counter for that long, was such a terrible idea and so on.
Left the yellow crust. That's why.
Exactly,
Jason.
right? And this is, what's been going on for me about this stupid mayonnaise and now I can't make this sandwich and so on and so forth. And if I treat that with, silence, and not like silence like I'm ignoring you, right. But that silence that kind of says, yeah, go on, right? Like I'm here, I'm listening. For a lot of people, they dive even deeper into what they were just talking about because, you don't like awkward silence either. And I don't know what else to talk about because I just said all of the things. And so let's revisit what didn't I say within that? And we end up uncovering another layer. We end up going, another foot down into what's actually really going on. And really, maybe it's not about the mayonnaise. Maybe it's, I didn't say goodnight to you last night or whatever the case is, right? Maybe it's that comment that I said, last week that just didn't sit right with you. And, but we never actually had a conversation about it. Right. Or, it's has nothing to do with you and me at all. And it has to do with, a family member that's been a pain in my butt lately or whatever the case, right? I'm dealing with a lot of stress at work. Apparently there's a lot of stressors around us even right now, right?
There's COVID, I guess?
Apparently there's something going on in the world. It's being stressful for people.
I've heard of it.
Right? But we're dealing with so many of these external pressures. right now.
And I wonder too if I have a counselor, so I'm all about therapy. I know, but the counselor that I've gone to, he'll just sit there and stare at me, and it drives me nuts.
Yeah, sometimes
can
it's
you
not
just
helpful.
ask a question or something? But inevitably, I do exactly what you said.
Right.
You end up, okay, well, if you're not going to say anything, I'm going to say something.
Yeah.
And so then you just go deeper and deeper. And there was an exercise we did a couple years ago. And I'm trying to remember the exact question. I think it was, you basically ask a person, tell me about yourself, and give them 2 minutes. And then you flip, and then you ask the same question. And by the third time you've asked that question, the person's giving you some really neat information that they would never tell.
Yeah.
But it's time. And I know for us in our house, like, when you sit down to chat, you've got your phone, you've got music on, you've got all these other things that I almost wonder if that space that is supposed to help us reflect, we've removed. And if that isn't part of the problem in a lot of our families, like if you're always so busy, it is very easy to sweep things under the rug, and then all of a sudden you get triggered the wrong way, and that mayonnaise gets put out one last time.
And that's
I
the
never
time.
loved you. I hated you. But it just breaks everything, and it's something so simple. Yeah, but it's hard because there's no way of saying it's not awkward. It is.
Yeah,
but silence is, and it's going to be awkward. And those. There's a reason people hire you to teach them how to do conversations, right? Like there's so many books that have been written on this because we suck at having those conversations. And I would argue our entire culture right now is struggling because nobody's had these conversations. Yeah. And so now you're just mad and you're lashing out, but you have all these, and again, youth, young adults, awesome. Yeah. But you don't have that life experience. Yeah. Right?
You think
but then the older people, but then by the time you realize you don't, well, that generation hasn't had these conversations anyways, but.
Yeah. Well, and like you're saying, there's so many different distractions around us, right? busyness, phones, technology in general. I mean, even look at just the way that our homes are set up. I was listening to a podcast on the way here where the person was saying, like, look at, you want to read more books and you want to watch less TV, but look at your environment. You sit down and there's a TV in front of you. Of course, you're going to watch TV. It's the path of least resistance, right? Your book's on the bookshelf. It's 5 steps away. The remote's right beside you. What are you going to do? Easy decision, whether you think about it or not, right? But I think that part of the other side of that is, look how many conversations are happening online now too, where I don't see your face anymore, right? And so. If I don't see your face, I can just say whatever that unfiltered thought that's going through, my mind, bad grammar and all. And, it's just going to come out, right? Even if it's spelled terribly, right? And sometimes you read some of those messages, you're like, I don't even know what you're trying to say here. Like you're not, 5 words are spelled correctly out of this whole thing.
So now I'm not even listening. I'm just judging the fact that, did you even go to school? What happened there?
Yeah. So years and years ago, there's these really smart guys from UCLA. They were studying communication. They wanted to kind of know, so what are those different packets of communication that kind of broadcast that message? And so they looked at 3 different things. They looked at the nonverbal communication, right? Like what are some of those things that our facial expressions, our hand motions, all of that kind of stuff, right? The paraverbal, so how you say what you say, so like your tone, your volume, your cadence, and then the actual words that were being said. One of the things that they found was, the actual words itself was about 7%, which is interesting. The nonverbal communication was 55%. And then the paraverbals were, I don't know, whatever's left, 37% or whatever it is. 35%. Yeah. I didn't get into this business because of my math skills.
Can we get some math from the peanut gallery?
Right? And now you take, all of a sudden you remove a lot of those nonverbals and now it's just text-based, right? And so some folks are saying, emoticons are like the new nonverbal communications, which is, I think really interesting in a lot of ways. A little while ago, we had this whole big group chat with a bunch of friends and stuff. And we were talking about what are we going to do and so on and so forth. And I just kind of kept doing, the one with the finger up. That's whatever that person said, I'm in for that. And I get home, my wife's like, I was like, what do you mean? She's like, why are you been flipping off everyone? The entire group conversation. She's like, put your freaking glasses on, man. Like, can't tell the difference between fingers now? Like, so, I mean, there's some danger in emoticons, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Yeah. But I mean, you think about it from a text base, like if I all of a sudden type out, nice hair, right? There's how many different ways can you say that, right? Like you can say it
Nice
like
hair.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice hair.
Exactly.
Nice hair.
Yeah. Like 3 completely different meanings right there.
But I find often now when I'm texting people, especially people I don't know very, very well, I add LOL quite a bit if I want them to make sure that it's like, this is a happy text.
Right.
You're not going to laugh out loud, but you need to understand that this is from a place of happiness.
Yeah. That's where this comment is coming from, right? Like we almost need to write in parentheses, here's the context in which I'm responding, which I mean, no one's going to do because that's ridiculous, right? But yeah, and I think that is where that lens in which we're viewing like all those interactions. So if you and I had, say, we're still on our mayonnaise journey and, that's all of a sudden going to start, all of a sudden you text me, the next day and you're like, hey, what's going on? Right. I can read that in a lot of ways, right? Like I can all of a sudden, that mayonnaise experience was not a pleasant experience and I'm still harboring some thoughts around that. And so I'm going to view that of like, it's none of your stinking business. Like, forget it, right? And this is just a fishing experiment. You're just wondering how am I? Like, are we good? Are we not good? Right? And I'm not going to give you that satisfaction.
Put the mayonnaise away, and I'll tell you how we are. I'll tell you. And it's funny we're doing this, but when I look back at the fights that Josie and I have had over the last 40 years or whatever we've been married. They're all ridiculous things. There's very few where there was a good reason to argue. It was just exactly that.
Yeah.
Put the mayo away.
Yeah.
How about you, put the toilet seat down? Well, how about you clean up the toothpaste? How about you stop sucking at your life? How about that? Like, and it's so interesting the way a lot of those things are so small. So what would you say? I'm a young couple. I'm getting married. And I want to develop good habits because I've listened to you and I realize it's a slow fade. And so it's not just the huge things. How do you develop things? What would you give as advice to young couples starting, saying, do these things because this really matters?
I would say notice some of those uncomfortable things that, in the conversations where you're like, I don't know if I want to bring this up. I don't know if I want to talk about this. Like, this is going to make me feel uncomfortable. And so for some younger couples, it's around financial stuff. Oh, I don't want to talk about finances. Like, oh, that's kind of, for others, it's around sex, right? I don't know if I want to tell him or her what I want or what I want to do or anything along those lines. That's awkward to have. Pay attention to some of those awkward moments. Pay attention to some of those things that make you feel uncomfortable. And then start developing a plan for how you can have those conversations with one another. Because those are the things that are going to slowly, I think, really start to build up, right? And so when you do feel upset, and not about every single thing, right?
Because some of it just is literally you had a bad day and you're frustrated. And when you're living together, there's just not every day you want to see that person that. And I'm frustrated that you're home right now. I'd like some space or whatever. That's just life.
That's been the interesting thing about COVID, I think. For a lot of people, they've all been stuck home with whoever their choice was. And they're like, I made a bad choice, right? And so we've been having problems for a while, and COVID in some ways has served as a magnifying glass on some of those problems. And in others, the foundation looked really smooth, it looked really great. But when you really zoom in, you can see some slight cracks there. No one's perfect. No couple is perfect. No relationship is perfect. We're all going to screw up. We're going to say stupid stuff. We're going to put our foot in our mouth. We're going to do things that aren't pleasing to other people. We're going to do things that are not pleasing to ourselves, right? And so I think that's where grace and compassion come in as well, right? That we need to offer ourselves that compassion. We need to offer ourselves that grace and extend that towards others. And so I think there is certain wisdom of, paying attention to what's going on inside your brain, inside your body, what is hitting you in the right way, what is not hitting you the right way. And then what does it look like to bring that intent and bring that effect into that public space? So that we can actually have an honest conversation about that, and to keep our eyes on the actual problem. And so, this will be the last thing I say, but I think that's one of the things that if you and I are tasked to make a new mug, we can have arguments about that mug. Should it be a left-handed mug? Should it be a right-handed mug? Personally, I think we need more left-handed mugs in our society today, because that's a whole nother rant for another time. But maybe that's what we're arguing about, right? Yep. You want a right-handed mug, and there's too many righties in this world. There's nothing for us lefties out there, and so as long as that mug stays between us, and we're both of our views are on that mug, we can have the most heated discussions and dialogues about this, and it's going to be productive. And we'll probably, maybe we'll come up with an ambidextrous mug or something like that, right?
Just two handles, one on both sides.
Two handles, it's perfect. It's fine for those folks that love double fisting, or for babies, or for, whatever, right? It's an all-purpose mug at that point. Yeah. But when that mug starts to fade from our view, then what's left is you and me. And so some of the comments that I'm going to say they're going to miss that mug. They're going to get lobbed over, under, around, and they're going to hit me. And I'm going to get defensive about that. And I'm going to start saying, what's Albert saying about me? I thought we were talking about this mug. Right. Now it's personal, right? And as things get more and more personal, that mug might as well be, in another person's house. Yeah. Because there's no mug there anymore. So anything that I say, and so part of that is, what does it look like for us to keep that mug in mind? What does that look like to continuously bring that mug back to our attention? And I think that's where some of that intent and some of that effect can come in of, that comment that you made about, having a double-sided mug, that really hit me personally. Silly example, but what are you saying? That I need two handles? Yeah. Like, you think I'm that stupid?
Well, what's interesting though, because when I think back to, our fights and our conflicts, a lot of them end up being exactly that. So for a lot of us as parents, a lot of the fights are over kids. And specifically, with disciplining kids, or when you're trying to make those types of decisions. Yeah. And there's a moment in that conversation where you know for sure that cup got moved. Because now it's just me and you bashing each other because we couldn't solve the cup. Yeah. We couldn't solve that issue. And so now we're just attacking each other. Yeah. So then maybe one of my last, I think we're almost out of time, but how do you live in the tension then? Because there are times where, the mug is a ridiculous example, but you can't solve the problem. And so with kids, I don't know what to do with this child. Neither do you. And so it's not like if we just stare at the cup long enough, we'll sort out a problem. There is no solution, but we definitely disagree. Yeah. How do you live in that tension and not allow it to destroy your relationship? Because it does so many, and I can see how it does. Like as you're a parent and your kids get older and you begin to realize some of these I can see why families would go, you know what? I'm going to bail because I think that'd be easier. Yeah. So how do you live in that tension and survive through that? Because I've talked to older people and they say when you get to the other side, it's awesome. But in the midst of it, that temptation to just say, no, I give up.
For sure. Well, and it's, how do you live out of both sides of that argument, right? So I'll give you a personal example. So my wife and I, from a political side of things, typically vote for different parties. And with, the past election, there was some really heated conversations, right? Around like so much so, like, you're an idiot. Like, you would actually vote for this person because of this? Like, this is ridiculous, right? Like, what about these people over here? What about some of these marginalized communities? What about, people that are stuck at home with COVID? What about, right?
Okay, on a side note, though, then this year, when we do our interviews for the provincial election, we're going to bring you two into the peanut gallery.
But what ends up happening is, so I say, and I mean, even just take politics out of it, whatever the issue is, maybe it's, what school do the kids go to? Maybe it's around, in-laws. Maybe it's around,
vaccinations.
Vaccinations is a huge one, right? What we often do is, so my side has a pro and a con. Just like every side, right? Your side has a pro and a con. But when we're talking, I'm saying, this is my pro, and I'm comparing it to your con. And so it's kind of a cross movement, if you will. If you kind of think of a grid, right? Where our pros are at the top, the cons are at the bottom. I'm comparing my pro to your con, which then you all of a sudden come from that con place, you bring it back up to your pro and come across to my con. And so we're having these diagonal conversations,
Yeah.
right? And it's not fair because
Right.
we're not actually comparing, apples and bananas to bananas,
Right.
right? In that sense.
Interesting.
And so what does it look like for us to drink out of both wells, in other words, right? And not like, okay, now we're going to drink out of yours and then we're going to drink out of mine, right? But what does it look like to actually pour them together and combine them? In certain, marriages and stuff, sometimes one of the traditions, you have the two different sands and you kind of pour them into one. How do we do that? That they just all kind of mix together within that. And it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of practice, a lot of grace, a lot of compassion, a lot of keeping our eyes on the actual mug.
Right. But even if you can just get your head into that space of saying, there are pros to, what Josie's saying, and let me compare my good to her good. But I'm just thinking, even the way politicians talk back and forth or anybody, you always do that.
That's exactly it.
I've just never heard it articulated, but yeah, you do that exactly.
Yeah.
You don't compare your good to your good. You just go, my thing's good and here's why. And yours is dumb because here's the worst part of your argument. Well, that doesn't make any sense.
No. Well, it creates this us and them dynamic, right? And so, politics, it makes sense because we need a common enemy to fight against.
Right.
And so if we're going to rally the troops, we need to identify what we're fighting against. And it's always going to be them. And once we start othering someone, whether it's a group of people, whether it is, it's whatever it is, they become less human. Right. And they're not human anymore. Right. And so then it's easy to say things I think that's part of what's happening even just from an online space is we can't see that person and we no longer think of them as human. Right. They're just the other.
Interesting.
And so, when we look at, some of the fights that we're having with our spouses, people in our workplace, whatever it is, right? And we're starting to compare, our incredible things to their terrible things that, we can probably all agree on that they're terrible. We can probably all agree that this is wonderful. We're, basically starting that us-them kind of process, that it's us versus them. But chances are we're both probably wrong and we're both probably right. And so what is it? And I think that's what, some of these older folks are talking about. That, I'm right 100% of the time, none of the time. Right? And so once we have some of that humility, maybe it is, that grace for another person, then we can say, okay, let's make a comparison around real things. What's your pro? What's my pro? Right. These are some of the benefits to both of those. Is there a way for us to combine them?
And clearly we're wired to do that because you wouldn't pick a spouse who's typically opposite of you unless there was something inside of you that goes, I need that. And we do that. Everybody's like, I married my opposite. Sure. Very rarely do you hear somebody be like, I married somebody just like me, right? That sounds very narcissistic, right? You're like, really? Yeah. But typically we marry opposites. So it's almost like something subconscious that we realize, okay, what they're giving me is stuff that I need. Yeah. But then all of a sudden you get to this moment where you're parenting and you're like, no, what my kid needs is only me. Now all of a sudden my spouse isn't needed in that equation because I'm so smart and they're so dumb.
Right. Well, let me give you a real example. So my wife is an introvert. And she works outside of our house. I am an extrovert, and I work inside of the house. It's a really great setup.
That makes perfect sense. Carry on.
And now, with kids being home at various stages throughout the last couple of years and so on and so forth, I don't see anybody except for our children, except for my immediate family. Right. And she sees all the people. So she comes home tired, and she comes home and I'm like, there's another there's fresh blood. Yeah. Right. And I'm like, hey, let's go to these people's house. Let's go do this. Let's go, talk to all the peoples. Right.
Adults. Where's adults?
Where's adults? I just want to have a conversation with someone that, isn't going to, burp in my face or whatever. Right. And so we've had to, basically come up with some different guidelines. And, part of that is around how we're individually doing, and so if she comes home and she's, operating at 20%, and I'm still operating at say 60%, she's the lesser number. And so maybe that's where we need to place our focus and just say, okay, let's just have a quiet night in. Like we don't have to worry about, going next door to see the neighbors or going across town or whatever. But if, she comes home and she's at, 60% and I'm at 20%, then maybe the sacrifice is, okay, we're going to go there. I don't feel like talking to people, but here we go. Right. Or maybe the compromise is I go by myself.
Yeah.
Right. So it's having those conversations saying, this is where I'm at. Where are you at? Right. What can we do to kind of move towards whatever that end goal is? Yeah. Sometimes that's going to mean sacrificing things. Sometimes that's going to mean compromising on things that maybe we don't, we want to spend time together. We're married, we're a couple, and it's okay if we're not spending 100% of our time together, right? Yeah. And so coming up with some of those guidelines having those conversations.
Awesome. Hey, well, thanks so much for this, man. I've learned a lot. Really appreciate it. And I'm sure my wife's gonna be watching, going, "Yeah, did you hear that, Albert? Did you hear that?"
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Hey, with that being said, you know what? How do you find a good mediator? Let's talk really quick, just as we close. Yeah. If you're in that spot, is there a place, or do you just Google mediation and pick? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, I would come up with a set of questions that are, important for you in having, because let's be honest, people, when I get invited into a situation, it's not because people want to hang out with me. Right. There are difficult things that are happening. People are often not at their best. Right. And so, have that list of questions of some of that quality of person that you want. And so for some that's experience, for some that is education, for some of that is just, the type of character or the process, whatever that might be. It's kind of the same thing with finding a good counselor or a therapist or minister or whatever, right? Find someone that you feel comfortable with. And so that means asking some questions of that person so that you do feel comfortable with and that all parties, feel comfortable with inviting them into that space. Because it's not going to be easy.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Hey, well, thanks for your time. Appreciate it. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.